All right, so to kind of continue where we left off, you notice that we have this little thing that pops up. It's called a toast. And the messaging in it is not that descriptive. So we kind of want to go back to where we're doing that toaster, which I think is on the shopping cart page. Let's just go ahead and open up the shopping cart page and let's find where we're doing the toast. Actually, that's on the products page. So the products page has this toast container where we're doing the toggle state. And we have a bunch of like hard-coded text that we copied over from React Bootstrap. So we want to make sure that up here we can say like successful or success or something. And 11 minutes ago, we don't really need this. Inside the body, let's just say product added to cart. We can come back later and actually like display what type of product was added to cart if we wanted to. It looks like there's the ability to add like an image here. I don't think we care about that. So let's kind of change that up and see how it looks like in the UI when we add a toast. So this says successful product added to cart. And I mean, honestly, that's good enough. You can like spend time styling this and it does go away really fast. So I am actually going to set it to 3 seconds. So let us see how that looks. It looks pretty good. So right now it's really cool that people can add stuff to the cart, but you'll notice if I refresh the page, they lose all of their cart history. It would be pretty cool if we could actually have the user log in or register an account so that when they add things to their cart, it saves that to a database. So later on when they log in, they can get that data back. There's different ways to do this type of persistence. You could do it in local storage. You could do it in like a cookie or a server session. But I figured since we're using Mongo, you might as well just like register and log in and then have these cart items stored on the user account. So let's try to do that. So let's do this from the back end again first. This is the way I like to do it, but you can do it front end first if you want to. Let's just go ahead and go to the server and we need to make a new endpoint for registering a new user. So let's go to our index here and we're going to make a new controller, or we're going to make a new endpoint here called like register, and we can say register controller. So what this controller is going to do is basically, like I mentioned, it needs to create a user account. So I'm going to say export const register controller. Sorry, it's exports dot register controller. Make sure I use the correct exporting. That looks good. And basically what we want the user to be able to do is pass in a username and password. So if you imagine that there's a form with an email and a password, or a username and password, when they click the register button on the form, it needs to hit this endpoint and pass it a username and password basically. So what we kind of need to do first before we can write code here is we need to go to our models and we need to make a new model for the user. We don't really have a way to store a user account. So let's just make a new model called user model. And we are going to kind of copy some of the code that was in the product model and paste that in here. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this a user schema. And I'm going to basically just put a set of number here, or cost. I'm going to say username is a string and password is a string. And then for product model, I'm going to rename that to user model and change this to user. So now we have a actual like a mongoose model that we can use to store a username and password. Just note that we need to base 64, or not base 64, we need to decrypt the password and salt hash it or whatever the proper security thing is. I'm going to do that probably at the end of this part, or maybe the next part of the series. I want to get something really basic working just to prove to you that we can log in and get like a JWT token back. And then later we can kind of make this more secure. But again, this is a tutorial for beginners. So it's like, so just keep that in mind. Don't get all mad if you don't see me doing bcrypt from the get-go, especially since we need to teach you how to even make this endpoint to begin with. So inside the register controller, we are expecting that the user is passing a username and password, right? So let's just go ahead and import that model. I'm going to go ahead and say const user model. Make sure I type that right. And then I'm going to say require dot slash models. Let me go up a level, dot slash model slash user model. All right, so very similar to the other endpoint. In order to create a new model, you just say await, and then you can say like new user model, and you could pass it rec.body, I believe. And we are going to return that back to the actual response. So I'm going to say res.json, and then I'm going to send back the created user object that we just kind of saved to Mongo. Again, make sure this is an async function because we need to run await on this. Actually, I'm kind of messing this up. This is a user instance. And I believe we need to say await user instance.save, if I remember correctly. And again, we already have code that does this. So just look at how we do it in the create products controller. We make a model, we save it, and then we send back the toObject. Again, I don't think we really need the toObject thing. I'm gonna get rid of that for now. I did notice that we're doing like res.send here. I think I'd rather do res.json. Using the JSON method basically sets like a response header of application/JSON so that the client knows how to decode it. If you just say res.send, I'm not sure if Express just looks at the object and like sets headers based on that, but I'd rather say res.json. Anyway, that was kind of a tangent subject. So let's verify. Again, I like to verify the endpoints by going to Advanced REST Client here, or Thunder Client. And we're going to try to hit that endpoint. So we're going to go make a new request. We're going to do a post request to register and make sure in the body we set some JSON here. Let me scroll down. So we need a username and then we need a password. And I think that's all we need. So the username could be like wdj@example.com, and then password could be like 123456. All right, so hopefully if we hit this endpoint, let me just go ahead and minimize this terminal. We don't really need it anymore, I don't think. Always bring it back later if we do. Let's just post this endpoint and see what happens. So it says connection was refused by the server. So let's kind of go back to our server and figure out what happened. It looks like it just crashed. So it says register controller is not defined. And I think it's because in the index, we made a new route. We didn't even change it to a post request. So typically when you're doing like actions that modify or create data, you want to do a post request. And then you want to make sure that we import this controller at the top of the page. So at this point, let's try using the Thunder client again and hitting that endpoint. We got back a 200 status. Okay, so everything should have worked. And if we, let me minimize this. We see we get a response back. So this is this is like your user object now, once you've registered. And it's hard to find where to actually drag this stuff. All right, so we have a username and a password, and that is stored on Mongo. So if I go to that Mongo client I showed you earlier, I should be able to connect and show you that I have a users table, and I have a document here, and this is basically the user ID. I'm not sure if this OID thing is. Let me look at this. I guess they all look like that. Cool. So that should hopefully make sense. You register, and then we could probably make another endpoint for logging in. But let's just do one thing at a time. So in the UI, it would be cool if we could actually hit this register endpoint and make sure everything's working. So let's go back to our client. I hope that all makes sense. Let me just do a really quick recap. We made a new post request endpoint on /register. It calls the register controller. That is basically creating a new user model. It's saving it and it's sending it back in a response. And then we created a user model here, which is creating a new schema that has a username and password and setting that up in Mongoose and returning that. So just basically a copy and paste of what we did for the create product. Should make sense. So in the UI, let's just go back and make a new route here. So I'm going to open up pages and I'm going to open up app.js. And we want to make a new page called like register. So let's just go ahead and pretend like we have a route called register, and that's going to make the component register page. All right, so we need to create register page. So let's go and create a page called register page.jsx. And I'm going to go ahead and make a function and return like a registration title. I'll just like each one of registration should be good, just to verify this is working. And make sure we go back and we auto import this page from our app. And so now if we go to our UI, we should be able to go to /register. And right now it's not doing anything. So let's try to figure out why it's not doing anything. Register page is a component. We're importing it from pages, and we have register page here. Everything seems good. I should probably load up my console and just do a hard refresh to make sure. All right, maybe it's just caching. Make sure you always have this terminal open, and make sure you always have disable cache checked, because sometimes stuff gets cached in your browser and you don't see the changes that you thought you should be seeing. All right, so on this page, we need to do something very similar to the other create products page, where we need a form where someone can type in a username and a password, or an email and a password. So let's go back and let's kind of go to the create products page and recall how we did this. Remember, we created a form. We have a function that allows us to basically update the form. A lot of this stuff is very, very similar. So honestly, what I like to do when I'm live coding or coding in general is just copy a page that does very similar functionality and just paste it right into your component. So because I did that, I'm going to have to rename some stuff here. So I'm just going to do that. And I think that's really all we got to do. So let's make sure this loads. We have that old create product page. Let's just rename some stuff. So I'm going to say register. And this form just needs a username. Technically, you probably want to use an email, but I'm just going to say username. And I'm going to say update form value of username, form of username. Just kind of do this for everything. Type of name is not even proper. This needs to be type of text, I believe. You probably don't even need to give it a type since the default's probably text. But yeah, so the first input form group is going to be the username, and we want to make sure that we have a default form object that has username and probably a password of empty string. All right. So all this other logic is we could probably abstract this out to a utility function soon, but for right now, I'm just going to keep it as is and we can refactor later. Let's go through and just kind of add in that second form group, which will be the password one. So I'm going to say password, and this is going to be a type of default. And the rest could just be deleted. We don't need a description. And then the button could say register. So at that point, let's go back. Notice that we have a username and password, and it just works like so. But notice that when the form is submitted, we're calling a function called create product, but we need to rename this to register user. All right, and remember, we made an endpoint called /register, so we could probably say /register here, and we could pass the form, which is going to have username and password, and then we can reset the form, and we're probably going to have to redirect the user to a dashboard here, which I'll show you how to do in a second. But let's make sure this works. So I'm going to go ahead and just type in a username and password here, I don't know, bob@example.com, and the password could be 123456. One thing I'll say is that this should actually be changed to a password type so that the input is starred out. So let's go back here, and I'm going to say type is equal to password. There you go. And let's just verify. If I click register, it should submit that form to the backend, to that register endpoint. Again, we already verified this works with Thunder client inside of VS Code, but it's always good to verify every step along the way. So we did it from the UI this time. It sent a post request. We got back a 200 status code, and we got back a request payload here. So if you look at this payload, again, this is the exact same thing that we saw in the Thunder client. We can also go and look at the database here. We should have another user. So we should have two. One of them should have Bob. All right, so this is Bob. And we did that all from the front end. So now at this point, what we want to do is we probably want to also call login after we registered that user to get back a JWT token. So we could kind of do that as well. Let's go back and create yet another backend endpoint. So I'm going to go here, go to server. And this time we're going to make an endpoint called login. So it's going to be a post request again to /login. That's going to call a new controller called login controller. We haven't created that yet, but we're going to do it right now. And I'm going to make a new controller called login controller. And let's just go ahead and copy some code from register controller and rename this to login controller. All right, so this is going to change. This logic is going to change, but we do want to use the user model to kind of look up a user. So go back to your router here. Make sure you auto import that before your app crashes because we forgot. And then what you can do is now we have an endpoint where you need to pass a username and password, and we need to verify that that username and password exists in Mongo. So instead of doing all this stuff, we could say user in DB, and that's going to say user model.find. And really what we want to do is pass in the request.body for right now. Well, I'll just do this. I'll say username rec.body.username. And if you're watching this and you're like already kind of experienced with coding, you'll notice that there's a ton of stuff we need to do in these controllers. Like we need to validate the inputs. We need to make sure that they can't like do any type of NoSQL injection and stuff. But again, this is like a beginner's tutorial. So if you already know that stuff, I don't know why you'd be watching a tutorial to begin with. But we're just trying to keep this as simple as possible. So we're fetching from the database that user using the username and password. So how login works is basically hit the database and check, does a real user exist with this combination of credentials? And what you could do is say, if that user doesn't exist, then we probably want to send back a status code. So I think you can say res.status of 401, and then I could say send invalid login. Keep it super generic. But if the user does exist, what you can say is do an else here, and I could just say return res.json of user in DB. Make sure I do a wait here. I believe that's an asynchronous method. So we wrote a lot of code. I mean, really, it's not that much code, but we should verify that the code does what we want. So let's go back to Thunder Client and let's try to hit that login endpoint using the same username and password that were created earlier. So the WDJ example, make sure you have that in your payload body. And I'm going to click send, and we get back a 200 status code. That means we are successfully logged in and we got the user. There are some issues. We got back like an array that we need to fix. And we also need to generate a JWT token. But if you were to change this to something else, notice that you get back, you actually get back a 200. So there's a big issue with our endpoint. We should have gotten back that error code. Let's go to Mongoose. And let's try to find there should be like a find one method. I don't want to like find everything. I think I just want to find the first one. So you can do a find one, and then you can pass something. And they're doing exec. I don't know if you really need that. You might, I don't know. So let's go back to our login controller, and instead of doing find, I'm going to say find one. And let's just go ahead and run that and see if we get a 401 error. So we do. So this works. Notice that if you pass in a username that doesn't actually exist or a bad password, you get back a 401 unauthorized. But the moment that you pass the right combination of username and password, you get back that user here. And then notice that this is an object now. We kind of fixed that from being an array to becoming an object that was returned from the backend just by using that find one method. So that kind of makes it a little convenient. But honestly, when you log in, what you want to do is you want to kind of sign this object in something called the JWT token, or just JWT, which stands for JSON Web Token. Let's go ahead and install on the server a package called JSON Web Token. So we're going to use that package to basically sign a token and send it back to the user so that the user can send that in further requests, and we can use that to authenticate / authorize the user. So inside of this controller, I'm going to say const JWT is equal to require JSON Web Token. And the way to do this is instead of sending back the actual like user here, I'm going to send back a token as well. So I'm going to say const token is equal to JWT.sign. I'm going to pass it user in DB. And I believe the second argument is a password. So in this case, I'm just going to say like my super secret password. But in the future, this needs to come from an environment variable. You don't want to actually hard code the secret in your code. You probably want to do like a .env file and pull that in. But again, we're trying to keep this really basic and simple so that you understand what's going on every step of the way. So now instead of sending back only user in DB, I'm going to send back token. And then I'm also going to send back user. So now if I were to go back and just kind of hit that endpoint like we did earlier, we should get back a token. Assuming I didn't mess something up, which I did. Let's see. Expected payload to be a plain object. So this is failing because we are sending in something I guess that's not a plain object. So I'm going to say toObject here, and maybe that'll fix our issue. There we go. That works fine. All right, so now you'll notice that we get back a token, and we also get back that user object. Kind of hard to see. I don't really have that much monitor space, but the token is what you're going to kind of cache in your browser or store in your browser's memory, and you're going to send that in a header with every future request. Now let me show you what this token is. This is kind of an important part. If you take this text and you go to jwt.io, you can actually paste this token into the left here, and you'll see what this token actually has in it. It's just some raw data that has the user name and the password. So this is a big security issue. We don't want to send back the password to the user once they've logged in, so we probably want to delete that. But just the main idea here is this token is not like, it's not encrypted. Like anyone can take this and decode it and view what's inside of it. So you want to make sure that you don't actually have anything secret or sensitive inside of this token. The main point of this token is that the server can verify that this was created from the server itself. No one else can actually create this token and verify it unless they have this super secret string or password, which hopefully you don't leak. Hopefully you are the only person who knows this, or your server is the only person who knows this. And so pretty much you'll see later on, we'll say like JSON jwt.verify, and then you'll pass in a token and you'll pass in that same string like this. And that is how you verify the token, right? Only the server should know this. All right, I do have a couple of other videos about JWT on my channel that you should check out if you need more information about this, but we will do the verification probably soon. But basically, we are sending back the token now, and I did say that you want to delete the password, so I'm going to say delete user in DB password. We don't want that ever kind of getting back to the user. So let's go ahead and hit that endpoint one more time and make sure that we don't get a password. We still got the password, so we probably need to do something else. Let's see, delete user in DB password. Let me just change this to a user object, and then I'm going to say delete user object.password. And then I'm just going to use that for now on. That's probably a safer way to do it, because deleting was not working on that Mongo thing for some reason. So let's try it again. All right, so now there's no password returned, which is a much more secure thing to do. Again, this is a beginner's tutorial, so there's probably a lot of stuff that I'm doing is not very secure, such as I'm still not decrypting the password in the database. But the main thing I'm trying to show you here is you get a token back, and when you log in from the UI, you need to store that token. So let's go back to the UI and make a login page. Like we already made a register page. We actually want to call that login endpoint after the user register. So let's go back to the register page, and then we are going to basically also call the login endpoint, right? Remember we made a login endpoint? We can call that with the exact same username and password combination. And hopefully if registration worked, it's going to await on that, and then it's going to call this with login. But we want to make sure that we get back a response here. And we want to keep track of the tokens. So I'm going to say const token and user from response.data. All right, so let me just show you this. If I were to print this out in the console here, we then should have access to this token. Not sure why this is grayed out. Okay. Let's go back to our UI. Let's register with like hello@example.com, and we are going to also do a password. Notice that it does two requests. It hits the register endpoint and it also hits login. But the important part is that the console now has the token. Your browser has the token, and you need to store that somewhere. So in our case, we're probably going to store it in context. So we could kind of, inside of app.js, you probably want to add another context called like user context. And you can wrap everything inside of that user context. So I'm going to say provider value is user state. Let me make sure this is all wrapped up. And then we need to make sure we can kind of have a state variable. So I'm going to say user state is equal to empty object for right now. Okay, so using that context here, user context, we can import it here. So const user set user equals use context. Remember, this is how you kind of import and use context. You basically just need to make sure you import the context from the main thing that's exporting it, which happened to be our app.js here. That's exporting it. So we are importing it here and we are using it here. And the whole reason we're doing this is so that we can update that user state with what we got back from the backend. So I'm going to say set user of token and user. All right. So far we've done quite a lot of stuff. I'm probably going to just redirect to the dashboard and kind of show you that we can now print the token or the user out or the username somewhere. In fact, let's do that real quick in the header. So the header should also have access to this user context. So I'm going to say get the user context from that app component here. And I want to just show up here that we have user.username if we really wanted it. I think it'd actually be user.user.username. It's kind of hacky. Let me make sure this works. Because sometimes this will be an empty object, so I'm doing this like question mark here. So I want to make sure that this actually works. And use context is not defined, so let's make sure we import that here. Oh, it's not that one. It's this one we need to auto import. Is that working? Use context. Okay. Okay. I cannot read property of undefined of username. So it is crashing because this is not defined. I think I need to say like user.user. Wait, I need to do this. I need to put the question mark there so it doesn't crash. All right, so again, what am I trying to show you? I'm trying to show you if I were to kind of register with whatever, it should store that user in my context, and then my header should display my email somewhere in the top. So let's try it. We'll click it, and notice that we got the header that showed up here. The only issue is that we should probably redirect the user to the dashboard or something once they've logged in. So let's go to React Router, and I think there is a use history. Actually, I think I know how to do this. So we can say when you're using a React Router, you can actually get the history function and basically change what page the person is on dynamically. So I'm going to say const history is equal to use history. Make sure you auto import that. And then down here, once we've set up the context and everything, we can say history. I think it's not push, and then just go to the dashboard or something. So that'll redirect the user back to the dashboard instead of the login registration page. And we should see that basically redirect us. So let's try that real quick. Click it. You're logged in. That token in the user is in your context, and we are redirected to the dashboard. Looks like there's a little error here. Let me fix that z-index error. Style z-index. Is that what you have to do? Little issue with that. Let's try to click on that. Product added to cart. And then somewhere else I need to put key. So I'm doing a map somewhere, and I'm not doing a key on something. So let's do a key on, what does this need to be? Probably a key on value or something. No, key on a column. Let's try that. Is that what's complaining about? Let's try refreshing the page. Products page. Can I just click this and go to the error? Oh. Oh, there's another map down here, so we probably need to do like product, add a key property and say product._ID. All right, let's see if that fixes our warning. All right, so this video has been going on for a while. I'm going to wrap this video up. Just kind of keep in mind that we're not really done with login and authentication and security. There's still a lot that we can do. But the main takeaway or the main flow that we added was the ability to register. That creates a user, puts in a Mongo, and then a login, which returns a token, which you need to store in your UI or in a cookie somewhere. And we're going to use that in the next part of this series. So just keep in mind and make sure you understand all the concepts that we kind of covered. But you could see that, using JWT wasn't too hard. You import a package, you call .sign, and you send it back to the user. And there's some more stuff we can talk about in regards to JWT, but that is like the general overview. Yeah, stay tuned for the next part of this series if you want to learn more about how to build out a MERN stack application. All right, happy coding.